You wake up at 3 a.m., you can't sleep, and somehow, impossibly, that's actually perfect for what I'm about to tell you, because the lore hiding underneath Invincible Season 3 is the kind of stuff that keeps people up at night even when they're trying their hardest not to think about it. So get comfortable, turn down the lights, and let me walk you through everything. Invincible Season 3 dropped and the internet absolutely lost its mind. But here's the thing that most people missed while they were busy reacting to the surface-level moments. The punches, the blood, the screaming. The real story is happening in the background. The real lore is buried in the details, the implications, the things the show is setting up that most casual viewers completely overlooked. Tonight, we're going deep, and by the time you drift off, your brain is going to be quietly processing some of the most fascinating world-building in modern animation. Let's start with something that I genuinely think is underappreciated. The entire premise of Invincible, the thing that makes it fundamentally different from every other superhero story, is that it's a show about the cost of power. Not the acquisition of power, not the celebration of power, the cost. Every single season has been about Mark Grayson slowly learning that being a superhero doesn't feel the way comic books told you it would feel. Season 1 was about discovering your father is a monster. Season 2 was about discovering that monstrousness isn't simple. Season 3 is about something even more complicated. It's about legacy. What do you do when the thing you were built to become is something you actively despise? Nolan Grayson, Omni-Man, is one of the most fascinating characters in the history of superhero fiction, and I want to spend a little time on why before we get into the Season 3 specifics. Because understanding Nolan is the key to understanding almost everything Season 3 is doing. He was sent to Earth with a mission he believed in completely, a mission that required him to view every human being on the planet as something less than fully real, less than worth protecting for their own sake. And then he built a life here, a real one. He had a son, he had a wife, he had 20 years of mundane human experience, and it changed him in ways he couldn't have predicted. The tragedy of Nolan Grayson is that he became human before he even realized it was happening, and then he had to reckon with what that meant. Season 3 continues to grapple with that reckoning, and one of the most quietly devastating pieces of lore that the season is working with involves the Viltrumite Empire itself. Because the show has been slowly revealing something uncomfortable. The Viltrumite Empire isn't just powerful, it isn't just ruthless, it's also, in a horrible way, efficient. The way they expand, the way they absorb civilizations, the way they integrate conquered worlds into their structure, it actually works. The planets that survive Viltrumite conquest do tend to become more stable over time. That's the insidious part of the lore. The argument for Omni-Man's mission isn't just naked brutality. There's a logic to it, a horrible, cold, utilitarian logic. And Season 3 makes you sit with that discomfort rather than letting you off the hook. Mark Grayson is aware of this now. That awareness is what makes his position so agonizing. He's fighting against an empire that his own biology makes him uniquely suited to serve. Every time he gets stronger, every time he pushes his limits, every time he survives something that should have killed him, he's becoming more Viltrumite. The irony is baked into his DNA. Now let's talk about the Sequids, because I feel like this storyline gets undersold in fan discussions and it deserves a lot more attention. The Sequids are a parasitic species that use hosts as vessels for a kind of hive consciousness. And what makes them genuinely terrifying from a lore perspective isn't the body horror, though that's certainly there. What makes them terrifying is what they represent philosophically within the world of Invincible. The Sequids are a dark mirror to the Viltrumite Empire. Both involve the subjugation of individual will to a larger collective purpose, both spread through conquest and absorption. The difference is that the Viltrumites believe they're elevating the civilizations they conquer. The Sequids don't even bother with that pretense. They simply take. The show is drawing a comparison there whether it says so explicitly or not. The Sequid storyline also has implications for the broader question of what consciousness even means in this universe. When a Sequid takes a host, is the original person still in there somewhere? Is there a version of consciousness that persists even under that kind of control? The show doesn't give you easy answers, and that's part of what makes it such rich material to think about as you're drifting off to sleep. Cecil Stedman. Let's spend some time with Cecil, because he's one of the most morally complex figures in the entire show, and Season 3 continues to develop him in ways that are genuinely interesting. Cecil operates from a utilitarian framework so extreme that it becomes almost indistinguishable from villainy. He will sacrifice individuals, relationships, and ethical principles without hesitation if he believes the outcome justifies it. And here's the uncomfortable thing: he's usually right. Not morally right, but strategically right. His calculations about threat levels, about necessary sacrifices, about the acceptable costs of keeping Earth safe, they tend to pan out. Cecil is what happens when competence and moral flexibility combine with genuine patriotism and genuine fear. He actually cares about humanity. He's just willing to do things to protect humanity that most humans would find unforgivable. The law question that Season 3 is really asking about Cecil is this: at what point does protecting something destroy the thing you were protecting? At what point does the means corrupt the end so thoroughly that victory becomes meaningless? There's also something fascinating happening with the Global Defense Agency itself as an institution. The GDA is essentially a shadow government operating on a global scale with essentially no democratic accountability. Cecil reports to who exactly? The show is deliberately vague about this. There are oversight structures nominally, but Cecil clearly operates well outside any meaningful constraints. The GDA is a post-superhero institution. It exists because traditional governments simply aren't equipped to handle the kinds of threats that exist in this world. But its existence also represents a kind of slow erosion of the normal structures of power, and Season 3 is quietly asking whether that's sustainable. Whether the solution to the problem might eventually become a problem in its own right. Amber, Eve, the women in Mark's life. I want to talk about them because the show has been doing something interesting with the female characters that doesn't always get the attention it deserves. Eve's powers are genuinely extraordinary from a lore standpoint. She can rearrange matter at a molecular level. She can create and destroy mass. She can theoretically do things that would reshape civilization if she chose to use her abilities at full scale. And the show is aware of this. There are moments where the camera lingers on what Eve is capable of in a way that suggests the narrative knows it's holding back something enormous. Season 3 continues that trajectory. Eve is becoming more powerful and more conscious of her power simultaneously. The question the lore is building toward is whether the kind of person Eve is, someone fundamentally oriented toward care and toward fixing things, can survive becoming that powerful without losing herself. Amber's role is different, but equally important for what it tells us about the world building. Amber represents the ordinary human perspective, not in a dismissive way, in a crucial structural way. She's the reminder that there is a world of regular people who wake up every morning and go to sleep every night in a world where beings capable of leveling cities exist and mostly try to function as people. The psychological reality of that is something the show takes seriously. What does it do to you to love someone who is fundamentally not like you, who operates under different physical laws, who faces dangers that you can't share and can't protect them from? Amber's storyline has always been about that gap. Season 3 continues to explore it. Now I want to talk about something that I think is one of the most fascinating pieces of background lore in the entire Invincible universe: the Flaxans. You remember the Flaxans? They're the dimension-hopping invaders from early in Season 1 who aged rapidly when they entered our dimension. They showed up, they were terrifying, and then they turned into dust and went away. But here's what's interesting. They figured it out eventually. They developed technology to compensate for the aging effect, and now they're a serious threat again. What's fascinating about the Flaxan lore is what it tells you about the nature of the threats in this universe. They don't go away, they adapt. The problems that seem solved in Episode 3 of Season 1 come back in Season 3 as more sophisticated, more dangerous, more prepared versions of themselves. The Invincible universe doesn't let you have clean victories. Every win comes with an asterisk. Let's shift gears and talk about the multiverse elements because Season 3 leans into this in a way that has massive implications for the lore. The existence of alternate dimensions, alternate versions of Mark Grayson, alternate histories, this isn't just a cool narrative device. It's a philosophical position the show is taking about identity and choice. If there are infinite versions of Mark Grayson, some of whom made different choices and became different people, what does that say about the choices this Mark has made? Are his values something fundamental to who he is, or are they the product of specific circumstances? If slightly different circumstances had produced a different Mark, a darker Mark, a Mark who leaned into his Viltrumite heritage, is that still him? The multiverse lore in Invincible is doing real philosophical work. It's not just spectacle. Angstrom Levy is the character who most embodies the multiverse themes, and his backstory is one of the most genuinely tragic in the show. He's a man who wanted, sincerely and genuinely, to help people. He wanted to use his dimensional travel abilities to absorb the knowledge of alternate universes and deploy that knowledge to improve life on Earth. His intentions were real, and then an accident turned him into a monster, literally and figuratively. Season 3 continues to deal with the fallout of what happened with Levy and what it represents. Because Levy is a cautionary tale about the gap between intention and outcome, about how the desire to do good, pursued without sufficient humility, without sufficient awareness of what could go wrong, can produce catastrophic results. He's a villain created by his own good intentions. That's genuinely haunting. Robot. Let me tell you about Robot, because the Robot storyline is one that I think reveals something deeply unsettling about the world of Invincible that the show only gradually makes explicit. Robot started as what seemed like a straightforward tech genius hero character. Cerebral, strategic, perhaps a bit cold but fundamentally on the side of good, and then the layers started peeling back. Robot, whose real name is Rudyard Connor, was born with a condition that made his natural body nearly uninhabitable. He operated remotely, through robotic avatars, for years. And when he finally secured a healthy body, something shifted in him. The show suggests, without being completely explicit about it, that the experience of operating through proxies for so long, of never being fully present in your own flesh, did something to his relationship with other people. Made them feel less real, made their suffering register differently. Season 3 continues to explore the consequences of his decisions and what they reveal about how power operates when it's divorced from accountability and from genuine human connection. The Teen Team storyline, which has been running in the background of all 3 seasons, is also doing something interesting from a lore perspective. These are young people who have been placed into violent, life-threatening situations because of abilities they didn't choose to have. The show is quietly consistent in its awareness that this is not normal or healthy. The adults in the room, Cecil most of all, use young heroes instrumentally, their assets to be deployed. The psychological damage this causes is something Season 3 is beginning to reckon with more directly. And that reckoning is interesting because it asks a genuinely difficult question. In a world where threats exist at the scale they exist in Invincible, is it actually ethical to sideline capable people just because they're young? Is the calculus different when the stakes are planetary? The show doesn't answer that question easily, and it shouldn't. Donald Ferguson. If you haven't been paying attention to the Donald Ferguson subplot, you've been missing something. Donald is Cecil's closest associate, a man who has served the GDA with complete loyalty for years. And the revelation about what Donald actually is, what Cecil did to preserve him, is one of the most quietly devastating pieces of lore in the show, because it raises the question of what loyalty means, what you owe someone who has served you faithfully, whether the person who wakes up after that kind of intervention is really the same person who went in. Donald doesn't know the full truth about himself, and watching him operate in Season 3 with that gap in his self-knowledge is deeply uncomfortable in the best possible way. Let me talk about Atom Eve's relationship to the broader political economy of the Invincible world, because this is something I find genuinely fascinating. Eve has the power to end scarcity, literally. She can create resources from nothing, or close enough to nothing that the difference is academic. She could, in theory, solve poverty, not ameliorate it, solve it. And the show is aware of the implications of this. The reason she can't just do that, the reason the world doesn't simply reorganize around her abilities, has to do with systems, political systems, economic systems, the structures of power and interest that resist even beneficial change, because change threatens the position of those who currently benefit from the arrangement. Season 3 touches on this tension. It's lore that has real-world resonance, and that's part of what makes Invincible more than just a superhero show. The coalition of planets deserves more attention than it typically gets in fan discussions. The coalition is an alliance of worlds that have banded together specifically in opposition to Viltrumite expansion. They're not a clean good guys organization. They have their own political complications, their own internal tensions, their own history of difficult decisions, but they represent something genuinely important in the lore. They represent the possibility of collective resistance, the idea that individual worlds, none of which could stand against the Viltrumite Empire alone, might together build something capable of pushing back. Season 3 develops the coalition storyline in ways that have significant implications for where the show is headed. Alan the Alien, who is the Coalition's most prominent figure in Mark's experience of the larger universe, is one of the great unsung characters of the show. His arc from largely comedic figure to genuine lore heavyweight has been one of the more satisfying character journeys. Alan knows things about the state of the conflict with the Viltrumites that Mark doesn't, and there are moments in Season 3 where you see Alan making calculations, weighing information, deciding what to share and what to hold back. He's not just a friend, he's an agent of a larger political structure with its own priorities. And sometimes those priorities and Mark's priorities align, and sometimes they don't. I want to spend a few minutes on the thematic architecture of Season 3 specifically, because I think understanding what the season is doing thematically helps you appreciate the lore choices it makes. Season 3 is fundamentally about inheritance, about what we pass down and what gets passed down to us without our consent. Mark is inheriting Nolan's legacy, his power, his reputation, his complicated position in both the Viltrumite Empire and human society. Debbie is inheriting the aftermath of a marriage built on a lie. The heroes of the GDA are inheriting a world shaped by decisions they didn't make and weren't consulted about. The season keeps returning to this question. What do you do with a legacy that is both genuinely valuable and genuinely compromised? Can you take the parts that help you and set aside the parts that harm you? Or are they too deeply entangled to separate? The Viltrumite homeworld lore is something Season 3 expands on, and it's worth dwelling on. Viltrum is a civilization that achieved its current form through internal purging as much as external conquest. The Viltrumites killed the weak among themselves. They selected aggressively for strength over generations. Their empire isn't just the result of superior power, it's the result of a philosophical commitment to the idea that strength is the only value that ultimately matters. And the interesting lore question is what that does to a civilization over the long term. What do you lose when you eliminate everything that isn't strength? The Viltrumites are powerful, and they are, in many ways, broken. Season 3 continues to develop the ways in which their civilization carries the trauma of what it did to itself in order to become what it is. Thrag, as the embodiment of Viltrumite values taken to their purest extreme, is one of the most genuinely frightening characters in the show, not because of his power level, though that's staggering, but because of his consistency. Thrag has never wavered. He has never doubted. He has pursued the Viltrumite mission with absolute clarity and absolute commitment for his entire existence. In a show full of characters struggling with ambivalence and complexity, Thrag's certainty makes him feel almost alien in a deeper sense than his biology. He's frightening because he represents what it looks like when you remove all the internal conflict, all the questioning, all the doubt. What remains is something that looks like conviction but functions like a weapon. Mark's relationship with his own violence is one of the most consistent and interesting threads running through all 3 seasons. He hits hard, he has always hit hard, and the show never lets him be comfortable with that. There are moments in season 3 where Mark does what needs to be done, and the camera doesn't look away, and the show doesn't offer him absolution. He carries those moments. They accumulate. The law question here is about what happens to someone who does necessary violence over a long career of doing necessary violence. How do you stay human? How do you stay the person you were before you had to do things that person couldn't have imagined? The city of Chicago and what happened to it in season 1 continues to echo through the narrative in ways that are easy to miss but important. The Omni-Man fight destroyed a significant portion of one of America's largest cities. People died. Thousands of people. The world knows what happened. They don't know exactly why. The full truth of what Nolan was doing was managed and suppressed to some extent, but they know that a superhero fight caused catastrophic destruction. The social and political aftermath of that event is lore that season 3 continues to build on. How does a society process that? How does it change the relationship between the public and the superhero community? How does it shape policy, politics, culture? Let's come back to Mark for a moment, because I want to talk about something specific. Mark's friendship with William and Rick, and the way ordinary human relationships function in his life, is not just character texture. It's load-bearing lore, because those friendships are the reason Mark doesn't lose himself. They're the tether. When you're capable of what Mark is capable of, when you can fly into orbit and hit something hard enough to crack mountains, the thing that keeps you oriented to human values is human relationships. Season 3 understands this. The domestic scenes, the quiet moments, the conversations that have nothing to do with superheroes, those aren't filler. They're the argument the show is making about what being human actually means. Debbie Grayson deserves an entire video to herself, but let me say something about what her storyline contributes to the lore of season 3. Debbie is living with the knowledge that her entire adult life was, in part, a construction, that the man she built everything with had a secret so enormous that it retroactively changes the meaning of everything. But here's what's interesting. Not everything is retroactively changed. Some of it was real. Nolan genuinely changed. He genuinely loved his family in ways he hadn't anticipated. The complication for Debbie is that both things are true simultaneously. She was deceived and she was loved, and season 3 doesn't give her an easy way through that. It just gives her the work of living with it. Now let me settle in and talk about something that might be the most interesting long-form lore thread running through the show. The question of what Earth actually is in the context of the larger universe. Humans without any enhancement are not a significant presence on the cosmic stage. They're fragile, short-lived, limited in what they can do and where they can go. But Earth keeps producing enhanced individuals. It keeps drawing the attention of larger powers. It keeps mattering in ways that are disproportionate to its actual population or resources. The Viltrumite Empire wanted it. Multiple other civilizations have targeted it. The coalition finds it strategically interesting. Why? Season 3 doesn't answer this question fully, but it continues to develop it. There's something about Earth's specific position, geographically, historically, in terms of the individuals it keeps producing, that makes it a hinge point for larger events. The lore is building toward an answer, and the answer, when it comes, is going to reframe a lot of what you've already watched. The role of the Guardians of the Globe, both the original team and the successive versions, is interesting lore-wise because of what they represent institutionally. The Guardians are essentially a public mythology. They exist not just to fight threats, but to give humanity a story about itself. A story about human capability and human resilience. The fact that the original team was murdered. The fact that the institution itself has been rebuilt multiple times. The fact that it's now populated largely by people who didn't make the choices that put them there, but inherited the role. All of that feeds into Season 3's inheritance themes. What do you do with an institution that is essential to public morale, but that has a dark and compromised history that the public doesn't fully know? I want to close by talking about something that I think is the emotional core of everything Season 3 is doing. Mark Grayson is a person who is becoming genuinely extraordinary, more powerful, more experienced, more aware of the actual scale of the universe and his place in it. And that process of becoming is lonely, in a way the show captures with real emotional honesty. The further you go beyond human limits, the harder it becomes to live within human scale. The things that matter to you, the things that ground you, start to feel both more precious and more fragile. You can see the end of things more clearly when you're capable of what Mark is capable of. You know better than anyone how quickly things can change, how completely a moment can become the last moment. That's what keeps Mark fighting, not ambition, not destiny, not obligation to some abstract idea of heroism. He's fighting because he knows what's at stake, and he's chosen, against every instinct of pure self-preservation, to put himself between the people he loves and the things that would hurt them. Season 3 is the season where that choice starts to feel like it might cost more than he can afford to pay. And that's the law that's really underneath all of it, under the Viltrumite history and the multiverse theory and the political machinations of the GDA. It's about a kid from a suburb of Chicago who found out his dad was a monster and decided, deliberately and with full knowledge of the cost, to try to be something different, something better. In a universe that keeps telling him strength is the only thing that matters, Mark Grayson keeps insisting that kindness matters, that love matters, that the people you protect are worth protecting not because of what they can do, but because of who they are. That's a genuinely radical position in the world of Invincible, and Season 3 makes it feel hard-won in a way that earlier seasons couldn't quite manage because we hadn't spent enough time with him. Now we have. Now we know him well enough to understand what it costs him to keep being that person. And we keep watching because we need to know if he can hold on to it. Close your eyes now, let all of that settle. The Viltrumite Empire and its cold logic, Cecil Stedman and his terrible calculations, Eve and the impossible scope of what she could become, Alan the alien, carrying knowledge he hasn't shared, Thrag and his frightening certainty, Mark Grayson, somewhere between two worlds, fighting to stay human. The law will be here when you wake up, and so will he. Still fighting, still choosing, every single time, to be something better than what he was built to be. Sleep well. Close your eyes, take a slow breath. Tonight we are going to the most violent, complicated, emotionally devastating corner of the entire animated multiverse, and somehow you are going to fall asleep there. Welcome to the world of Invincible, and specifically, the lore that made Season 2 one of the most talked about chapters in modern animation history. If you have never seen Invincible before, do not worry. We are going to ease you in like a warm bath that slowly, gently reveals it has been full of cosmic horror this entire time. And if you are already a fan who just wants to drift off to the sound of someone walking through all the magnificent detail woven into this show, then you are absolutely in the right place. Tonight we go deep, we go slow, we go through every layer of lore that made Season 2 feel like an earthquake that kept happening even after it was supposed to stop. So settle in, pull your blanket up, let the world outside your window do whatever it needs to do. None of that matters right now. Right now we are talking about Mark Grayson, a boy who inherited a universe of responsibility, pain, and impossible choices. And we are talking about the universe that crushed him under its weight and expected him to keep flying anyway. Let us start at the very foundation, because every structure this massive deserves to be understood from the ground up. Mark Grayson grew up believing his father was the greatest hero who had ever lived. Nolan Grayson, known to the world as Omni-Man, was a Viltrumite, a member of a warrior civilization so physically powerful and so deeply committed to their own supremacy that they had spent thousands of years conquering planets and absorbing weaker species into their empire. The Viltrumite philosophy was not subtle. Strength was everything. Weakness was an insult to existence itself. And the empire they built stretched across the cosmos like a slow-moving catastrophe that no one could stop, because no one was strong enough to even try. Nolan had been sent to Earth decades before the events of the show. His mission, delivered quietly and without fanfare, was to prepare the planet for eventual integration into the Viltrumite Empire. The plan was not dramatic or sudden, it was patient. Nolan would embed himself in human civilization, gain trust, become beloved, start a family, and when the time was right, when Earth had been softened from the inside, the Viltrumites would arrive and the planet would simply become theirs. But something happened that the Viltrumite Empire had not anticipated. Nolan fell in love, genuinely, deeply, in a way that complicated everything. He loved Debbie. He loved Mark. He built a life that he was not supposed to care about, and then he spent years pretending he did not care about it as much as he did, because caring was not something his civilization valued. This internal fracture, this war between the cold Viltrumite programming running through his identity and the warm human life growing around his heart, that is the engine of everything we see in Season 1, and by the time Season 2 begins, that engine has already exploded. Nolan has fled Earth after a confrontation with Mark that left both of them broken in different ways. The physical damage was one thing. The psychological damage was something the show would spend its entire second season slowly mapping. Now here is where the lore gets genuinely fascinating, because Invincible Season 2 is not really a story about punching. It is a story about inheritance, about what gets passed down from parent to child, whether you want it or not, about what it means to discover that the person you loved most was also something monstrous, and then to look in the mirror and wonder how much of that monster lives inside you. Mark carries Viltrumite DNA. His powers come from that bloodline, his ability to fly, his near invulnerability, his strength that increases the longer he survives in combat. All of it is Viltrumite, and the Viltrumite Empire is very interested in him, not because they want to destroy him, but because they want to use him. Because a half-human, half-Viltrumite child who was raised on the planet they intend to conquer is an incredibly useful asset. He knows the planet, he knows the people, he could make the whole process so much cleaner. And Mark knows this. He knows what he is, biologically. What he does not know yet, not fully, is what he is going to choose to be. Let us talk about the Viltrumite Empire in more detail, because the lore surrounding their civilization is one of the richest veins of world-building the show has to offer. Thousands of years before the events we witness on screen, the Viltrumites were not so different from any other powerful civilization. They had disputes, they had factions, they had internal conflict. But at some point, a combination of biological evolution and cultural philosophy converged into something terrifying. They became nearly immortal. They stopped aging in any meaningful way. Their bodies became so resilient that killing a Viltrumite was less a matter of physical force and more a matter of endurance, persistence, and extraordinary circumstance. The problem with becoming nearly impossible to kill is that it tends to breed a particular kind of arrogance. When you cannot be hurt, when you outlive everyone around you, when the universe seems to bend to your strength, you stop asking whether your actions are right. You start asking only whether they are possible, and for the Viltrumites, almost everything was possible. They purged their own civilization of weakness. At some point in their history, a plague reduced the Viltrumite population dramatically, and the survivors were the strongest, the most resilient, the most ruthless. This bottleneck event shaped everything that came after. A civilization of thousands became a civilization of dozens, but those dozens were each individually capable of defeating armies, and they used that capability to build an empire that expanded not through technology or diplomacy, but through raw, overwhelming, unstoppable physical dominance. By the time Season 2 is unfolding, the Viltrumite Empire is ancient and massive and operating with the quiet confidence of something that has never truly lost. They do not rush, they do not panic, they have time, and they know it, and that patience is somehow more frightening than aggression would be. Now, somewhere in the vast architecture of the cosmos that Invincible builds, there is another civilization worth understanding, one that exists in direct and complicated tension with the Viltrumites, and one whose agents are going to become increasingly important as the season progresses. The coalition of planets is essentially what it sounds like, a gathering of species and civilizations who recognized, usually after suffering through it firsthand, that the Viltrumite Empire was an existential threat to everyone who was not a Viltrumite. The coalition does not have anything close to the raw power of a single Viltrumite warrior. What they have is numbers, intelligence networks, and a very long memory for grievances. They track Viltrumite activity, they gather information, they work to undermine and outmaneuver an enemy they cannot simply overpower. One of the most compelling characters connected to the coalition is Alan the alien. Now Alan, when we first encounter him in the broader Invincible story, seems almost comedic. He shows up on Earth regularly to test its champion as part of a routine evaluation program, apparently not realizing for years that he was testing the wrong planet. There is a warmth and an absurdity to Alan that makes him immediately lovable. But as Season 2 develops, Alan transforms into something more significant. His role within the coalition deepens, the stakes around him increase, and through Alan, we begin to understand the true scale of the war that is quietly being waged against the Viltrumite Empire in the spaces between stars. Alan possesses a unique biology. He is an Unopan, but he is a remarkable outlier even among his own species. His body adapts after serious injury, healing and then becoming stronger than it was before the damage occurred. This makes him remarkably difficult to kill permanently, and it means that every near-death experience only makes him more formidable. There is something almost poetic about that, given the themes the show keeps returning to: survival through suffering, becoming harder and stronger, not despite the pain, but because of it. Now let us drift toward the emotional core of Season 2, because the lore is rich, but the heart of it all is human, even when the characters involved are not entirely human themselves. What Season 2 does with Debbie Grayson is quietly one of the most emotionally sophisticated things any animated series has attempted. Debbie is not a superhero, she does not have powers. She is a woman who built her entire adult life around a man she loved, raised a child she adored, built a home and a community and a sense of meaning, and then discovered that the foundation of all of it was a lie of the most profound and violent kind. The grief Debbie carries in Season 2 is not just about a marriage ending, it is about an identity being destroyed. Who is she if she is not Nolan's wife? What does it mean that she loved someone who viewed humanity as an inferior species? Does that love become retroactively shameful? Does it invalidate everything she felt? The show refuses to give her easy answers, and that refusal is a form of respect for the complexity of what she is experiencing. She drinks too much. She isolates. She has moments of genuine connection that feel hard-won and precious. And she keeps existing in a world that does not stop moving just because her personal universe has collapsed. The Debbie storyline in Season 2 is the show's quiet argument that trauma does not make you noble, or strong, or better. It just makes you someone who has been through something terrible, and you find your way through it imperfectly, and slowly, and with a lot of setbacks, and that is actually enough. Meanwhile, Mark is trying to hold together something that has already been fundamentally altered. His relationship with Amber had become strained and eventually ended in the wake of the Season 1 revelations. Mark had kept his identity secret from her for too long, and the secrecy itself, the choice to protect her by not trusting her, had poisoned what they had. The end of that relationship is not dramatic in the way superhero stories usually handle heartbreak. It is just sad. Two people who genuinely cared about each other, separated by circumstances that were too big and too complicated to simply love their way through. And then there is Atom-Eve. And the Atom-Eve relationship is where the show does something genuinely masterful with pacing and emotional investment. Eve Wilkins, Atom-Eve, is one of the most powerful beings on the planet. Her ability to manipulate matter at the molecular level is staggering in its implications. She could, theoretically, reshape the world. She could solve resource problems, rebuild destroyed environments, create whatever is needed, wherever it is needed. But the show is thoughtful about the psychological weight of that kind of power. Eve is someone who is constantly aware of the gap between what she could do and what is actually being done. It creates a low-level anguish that runs through her character like a current. Her relationship with Mark develops slowly, organically, built on years of genuine friendship and mutual understanding. They know each other, they have seen each other at their worst and their most uncertain. There is a shorthand between them that romantic relationships between people who met as strangers simply cannot have. And when Season 2 begins moving their connection towards something more explicitly romantic, it does not feel rushed or convenient. It feels like the show honoring the slow build of something real. But Eve also carries her own trauma. Her backstory, explored in depth in one of the most emotionally powerful standalone episodes in the show, reveals that she was a created being, the product of a government experiment designed to generate superpowered assets. Her parents, the people who raised her, were not her biological parents in the conventional sense. And their relationship with her was complicated by what she was and what she represented. The episode devoted to her origin manages to be devastating and tender at the same time, and it adds layers to every scene she appears in afterward. Let us travel outward again, back into the cosmic scale, because the lore of Season 2 is not content to stay small for long. The sequids are a fascinating and deeply unsettling element of the season's mythology. They are a parasitic species, each individual organism unremarkable, but collectively capable of something that functions like a hive mind, capable of taking control of a host body and operating it as a vehicle. The horror of the sequids is not physical, it is the loss of self. The idea that your body could be walking around, using your voice, wearing your face, while whatever was uniquely you has been pushed somewhere small and powerless inside. They connect to one of the secondary storylines of the season that takes place off-Earth, in the broader cosmos, and they demonstrate the show's commitment to building a universe that contains genuinely different kinds of threats, not just more powerful punches, but conceptually alien dangers that operate by entirely different rules. Speaking of threats that operate by different rules, let us talk about the Flaxans. These are one of the season's more visually memorable adversaries. They come from a dimension where time moves at a radically different rate than in our own. The result is that when they cross over into our dimension, their biology ages extraordinarily rapidly. A Flaxan invasion force that enters our world and is not immediately successful will simply age to death over the course of hours from our perspective, even though they have been fighting for what feels like a much longer time from their own experiential standpoint. It creates a unique military problem. If you can simply outlast the first wave, they lose. The challenge is that each time they come back, they have had, from their perspective, vast stretches of time to analyze the previous failure and develop countermeasures. So each new invasion is fought by a version of their civilization that is generations more advanced than the last. This is the kind of science fiction lore that rewards thinking about it slowly, which makes it perfect for the context of falling asleep. Just let your mind wander through the implications. What is it like to be a Flaxan soldier, to cross over into another dimension, knowing that every moment you spend there is burning through your lifespan at an accelerated rate? To know that the mission requires speed, not just tactically, but biologically. There is something almost tragic about it, a warrior people fighting against entropy itself, using the most dangerous clocks imaginable. And then there is Cecil Stedman. Cecil is the kind of character who is fascinating precisely because the show refuses to make him simply a villain or simply an ally. He is the director of the Global Defense Agency, which is essentially a government organization built around the concept of responding to superhuman and extraterrestrial threats to Earth. Cecil is brilliant. He is paranoid. He is ruthless in exactly the way someone in his position would need to be if they were genuinely trying to protect a planet that keeps getting attacked by beings capable of cracking continents. His relationship with Mark is one of the central tensions of Season 2. Cecil wants to use Mark as an asset. He wants to direct Mark's power towards Cecil's definition of the greatest good for the greatest number, and there is a version of that argument that is almost convincing. Cecil has information Mark does not have. Cecil has context. Cecil has made hard calculations that have, in his accounting, saved more lives than they have cost. But Mark has watched what Cecil's utilitarian calculus looks like in practice, and it looks like things Mark cannot accept. It looks like treating human beings as variables in an equation rather than as people whose inherent dignity matters. The conflict is not cartoonish. Cecil is not wrong about everything. Mark is not naive about everything. They are two different philosophies about how to protect something precious, and the tension between them is genuinely unresolvable in any clean or satisfying way. Let us find our way to Nolan now, because the Nolan-Grayson storyline in Season 2 takes him somewhere unexpected and genuinely moving. After fleeing Earth, Nolan does not go back to the Viltrumite Empire directly. Instead, he finds himself on a planet called Thraxa. And what happens on Thraxa is a window into a question the show has been building towards since its first episode. Can someone like Nolan change? Not just tactically change, not just recalculate his strategy, but actually become something different at the level of values and feeling. On Thraxa, Nolan does something that echoes his time on Earth in ways that are both obvious and worth sitting with. He builds another life. He connects again, on terms that are different from before, but that reflect some of the same impulses, the hunger for genuine relationship, for meaning that is not just conquest. And this second life, this echo, forces the question of whether what happened on Earth was an aberration for Nolan, something that happened to him once, or whether it reveals something more fundamental about who he actually is beneath the Viltrumite conditioning. The answer the show offers is ambiguous in the most interesting way. Nolan is not redeemed in any simple sense. He has done terrible things that cannot be undone. The lives he ended, the damage he caused, those are facts that cannot be revised by whatever growth occurs afterward. But there is something happening in Nolan that is not nothing. And the show seems genuinely uncertain about what to do with that something, which feels true to how we actually understand people who have caused harm and are in some genuine sense trying to become different. His eventual capture by the Viltrumite Empire is where Season 2 begins pulling its threads together. Because a Viltrumite who has gone off mission, who has been compromised by genuine emotional attachment, who refused to carry out the conquest of Earth when the moment arrived, is not just a disappointment to the Empire, he is a problem. He is evidence that the Viltrumite ideology has a vulnerability. That exposure to real relationships and real love can erode the certainty that makes a Viltrumite soldier so effective, and the Empire cannot allow that evidence to propagate. Nolan on trial, Nolan in Viltrumite custody, represents the show engaging with its deepest question. What does justice look like when the perpetrator is also someone you love? What does it look like from Mark's perspective, knowing that his father is being held by an empire that represents everything terrible about the Viltrumite legacy, an empire that also created his father, shaped him, sent him on the mission that ended up defining Mark's entire life? The emotional geography here is impossibly complex, and the show navigates it without pretending the complexity can be resolved. Let us take a moment to breathe with the Guardians of the Globe, because the institutional lore of the superhero community within Invincible's world is its own rich subject. The original Guardians were killed by Omni-Man in the Season 1 premiere, a moment of brutal efficiency that reframed everything the show would do afterward. The new Guardians that form in the wake of that tragedy are a genuinely different kind of team. They are dealing with the institutional trauma of knowing that the most trusted hero in their world committed mass murder against his own colleagues. They are dealing with public relations challenges, with internal trust issues, with the challenge of building cohesion among people who are each carrying their own complicated histories. Amber Bennett's brother, Robot, whose real name and real nature become increasingly significant as the show progresses, is perhaps the most layered figure in the Guardians storyline. Robot is a genius operating within a body that is not his own, using technology to bridge the gap between his actual physical form and the world he inhabits. His relationship with Monster Girl is one of the genuinely tender relationships the show explores in Season 2, complicated by the inverse aging problem that their respective physiologies create. Every time Monster Girl transforms, she loses a bit of time, growing younger rather than older. Robot, who is intimately familiar with the experience of existing in a body that does not match your internal sense of self, brings a particular depth of understanding to that relationship. And then there is the question of what Robot actually wants, not for the team, not for Earth, but for himself. Because Robot is someone with an extraordinary mind and a set of capabilities that go far beyond what any of his colleagues fully understand, and Season 2 begins sketching the outlines of an ambition that will have enormous consequences. Let us move toward the quieter emotional spaces of the season, because the lore of Invincible is not only the cosmic and the catastrophic. It is also the intimate. William Clockwell, Mark's best friend, is a character the show uses with great skill to keep the human scale visible even as everything around Mark gets larger and more overwhelming. William knows Mark is invincible. Their friendship has survived that revelation and the complicated feelings that came with it, and in Season 2, William's own emotional life, his relationships, his grief, his attempts to build something that feels stable in a world that keeps getting violently destabilized, provides a through line back to the ordinary human experience. There is something the show understands about why someone like Mark needs someone like William when you are the child of a Viltrumite, when you are tangled up in intergalactic politics and fighting beings who can shatter mountains. You need a friend who will sit with you and be ordinary. Who will talk about things that do not matter in the grand scheme of cosmic history? Who will remind you that the grand scheme is not actually the only scale that matters? The Angstrom-Levy storyline is one of the most significant villain arcs in Season 2. Levy is a character whose tragedy is embedded in his origin. He is a man with the ability to open portals to alternate dimensions, a genuinely remarkable power that he has tried to use in service of a humanitarian mission. He wanted to gather knowledge from across the multiverse, to collect the wisdom and the survival strategies of countless alternate versions of human civilization, so that the version he belonged to could benefit from all of that accumulated understanding. The accident that ruins everything, the event that transforms him from a well-intentioned researcher into someone consumed by hatred and obsession, is connected to Invincible in a way that Levy believes, but that is actually more complicated than his grief allows him to see clearly. His body is horribly damaged. His mind becomes a repository of memories from multiple alternate versions of himself, which creates a psychological fragmentation that would be difficult for anyone to hold together, and the emotion that organizes all of that fragmentation, that gives it structure and direction, is rage at Mark Grayson. What makes Levy fascinating as an antagonist is that the show asks you to see the genuine wound underneath the villainy. He is not wrong that his life was destroyed. He is wrong about the clearest moral conclusions he has drawn from that destruction. And his campaign against Mark forces Mark into situations where the show examines something important about heroism, about what you do when someone who has genuinely suffered tries to destroy everything you are trying to protect, when the villain has a real grievance, when the right answer is not a clean one. The multiverse elements the Levy storyline introduces are handled with real care. The alternate dimensions we glimpse through his portals are not just spectacle. Each one is a version of the story we have been watching, bent in a different direction by a different choice or a different event. They serve as reminders that the version of events we are following is not inevitable, that history is contingent, that the characters we have come to care about exist in a particular configuration that could easily have been otherwise. And in that reminder is something that functions almost like comfort, if you let yourself feel it from the right angle. The fact that things could have been different means that what happened was a series of choices, and choices imply that future choices also matter, that the story is not already written, that Mark, who carries such weight, might still find a version of his future that is not determined entirely by the worst things his inheritance contains. The final stretch of Season 2, the convergence of the Viltrumite threat, the consequences of Cecil's methods, the state of Mark's relationships, the question of Nolan's fate, all of it comes together in a way that feels less like a traditional climax and more like an emotional reckoning. The show is not really trying to resolve its central tensions, it is trying to honestly portray what it looks like to live with them, to be someone who cannot fix everything, who cannot unmake the past, who cannot know with certainty whether the choices being made in the present are the right ones. Mark at the end of Season 2 is not victorious in the traditional sense. He is still standing, he is still choosing, as deliberately as he can, to be something other than what the darkest possibilities of his nature might allow. And in the context of everything we have walked through tonight, that choice, the simple, difficult, unfinished, constantly renewed choice to try to be good even when good is unclear and hard and costly, that is where the lore of Invincible Season 2 lives most fully. The universe the show builds, from the Viltrumite Empire to the coalition of planets, from the Sequids to the Flaxans, from Cecil's utilitarian calculus to Debbie's grief, to Eve's molecular miracle and William's ordinary friendship, all of it exists to ask a version of the same question. Given what you come from, given what you are capable of, given what you have already done, and what has already been done to you, who do you choose to be? And Mark keeps choosing imperfectly, with setbacks, with moments of doubt and exhaustion and genuine failure, but choosing. Breathe out slowly. You have traveled a long way tonight. From the streets of a city that keeps getting destroyed and rebuilt, to the courts of an empire that has never known what it means to lose, from a mother drinking too much wine in a house that used to feel like home, to a boy flying alone in the dark, above a world that is counting on him whether he asked for that responsibility or not. Let all of that settle around you now. The lore is not going anywhere. The story will be there when you wake up. The multiverse is patient. The Viltrumite Empire has waited thousands of years. Your pillow is soft. Your breathing is slowing. The questions Mark carries will still be there to carry tomorrow. And somehow, in this particular moment, that fact is not frightening. It is just the shape of an ongoing story. The stars are out there. The cosmos is doing what the cosmos does, vast and indifferent and full of things we do not yet understand. Mark Grayson is up there somewhere, flying above the cloud line, looking down at something he loves and does not fully know how to protect. And you are here, warm, still, letting the weight of the day lift off your chest, like someone finally learned to fly. Sleep well. The Guardians have got the watch tonight. Picture this. You're lying in your bed. The room is dark. Everything is quiet. And somewhere out there across the universe, a man in a red and yellow suit is carrying the weight of every single world he has ever tried to save. Close your eyes. Let the story come to you. Welcome to the world of Invincible. And tonight we are not rushing through anything. We are not summarizing. We are not cramming timelines or arguing about who would win in a fight. Tonight, we are just going to drift through the lore together, slowly, the way you might float downstream on a river at night, watching the stars above you and letting everything just wash over you gently. So get comfortable, pull your blanket up, let your body sink into wherever you are right now. And let me tell you about a universe so vast, so layered, so full of impossible sadness and unexpected hope that by the time we reach the end, you might just find yourself somewhere between asleep and dreaming, suspended in that perfect quiet place where stories feel real. Let us begin at the very beginning. Not with a fight, not with an explosion. Let us begin with a planet. Far away, so far away that the distance itself becomes meaningless, there exists a planet called Viltrum. Imagine looking at it from space. It is beautiful, the way many things that hide terrible secrets are beautiful. From the outside, it seems almost like a paradise, a world of extraordinary beings, a civilization that rose to heights that most species could only dream about reaching over thousands of years. The Viltrumites were not always what they became. Long ago, they were simply a people. They had flaws, they had weakness, they had the full spectrum of ordinary existence. But something changed on Viltrum, something that would reshape the destiny of countless worlds for eons to come. Their leader, a being of immense power and absolute conviction, decided that weakness was a disease. And so began a purge, not an invasion of another world, a purge of their own. The Viltrumites turned on themselves, killing anyone who was considered too weak, too slow, too fragile, too afraid. By the time it was over, half the population was gone, but what remained was something terrifying. A civilization of pure physical perfection, beings capable of flying through space, surviving in the vacuum between stars, healing from wounds that would destroy anything else, and living for thousands of years without aging in any meaningful way. From that darkness, the Viltrumite Empire was born. And its mission was simple, if you could call anything about it simple: go out into the universe, find other worlds, and bring them into the Empire, not always through destruction, not always through war, at least not at first. The Viltrumites were patient in a way that only beings who live for thousands of years can be patient. They would send one of their own to a planet. That lone Viltrumite would integrate, would live among the people of that world, would wait, and in time would begin to prepare that civilization for absorption into the Empire. It was a strategy of quiet domination, a long game played across centuries. One of those Viltrumites was sent to Earth. His name was Nolan Grayson, but on Earth he became known as something else entirely. He became Omni-Man. Breathe. There is no rush here. Let his story settle around you like a warm fog. Nolan arrived on Earth and did something that was supposed to be strategic, but became something far more complicated. He fell in love. He married a woman named Debbie, a human woman, with a warmth and a gentleness that even 1,000 years of Viltrumite conditioning could not make him immune to. He built a life. A real life. He had a son. That son was named Mark Grayson. And everything we know about the world of Invincible flows outward from that single, extraordinary fact. Mark grew up as the son of the world's greatest superhero. Think about what that must feel like. Your father is essentially the most powerful being on the planet. He flies. He has saved the world more times than anyone can count. He is calm and strong and steady, the way mountains are calm and strong and steady, and yet he still comes home for dinner. He still throws a baseball with you in the backyard. He is just Dad. Mark waited. Every child of a Viltrumite eventually develops powers, but the timing is uncertain. It could be early, it could be late, and for Mark, it felt late. He watched his father soar through the skies and wondered if that part of him would ever wake up. And then one day, it did. He was taking out the trash of all things. He threw a bag of garbage with a little too much force, and it sailed so far into the distance that he stood there in the alley behind his house, just blinking at the sky where it had disappeared. Something had shifted inside him. Something ancient and Viltrumite had finally stirred. That is how Mark Grayson became invincible. Let that name sit with you for a moment. Invincible. There is something beautifully ironic about that name, because the story of Mark Grayson is not really about being unable to be hurt. It is about being hurt over and over and over again in every way a person can be hurt, and choosing to get back up anyway. The name almost becomes a challenge the universe keeps trying to meet. He began training. He got a suit. He started doing the superhero thing, learning how to use his strength without destroying everything around him, how to fly without losing himself in the sky, how to be something more than just a boy with powers. He had guidance from his father. He had a handler of sorts at the Global Defense Agency, Cecil Stedman, a man whose moral compass pointed somewhere complicated. And he had friends, other young heroes, other people figuring out what it meant to do this impossible work. But all of that, the training and the suits and the sidekick adventures, was just the surface of something much deeper, because Nolan Grayson was keeping a secret. The whole time he had been on Earth, playing the role of humanity's greatest protector, he had been Viltrumite first. His mission had never changed. He was on Earth to prepare it, and the preparation was almost complete. One day, without warning that felt adequate for what it was, Nolan revealed everything to his son. and then he tried to make Mark understand why what the Viltrumites were doing was right. When Mark refused to agree, refused to abandon humanity, refused to see the billions of human lives as insignificant compared to the age of Viltrumite civilization, his father did not just walk away, he hit him. What followed was one of the most quietly devastating sequences in the entire story. Not devastating for the spectacle of it, though it was spectacle, two beings of nearly incomprehensible power tearing through the planet, crashing through cities, falling through the sky again and again. No, it was devastating because of what it meant. This was a father and a son, and every blow landed on something far more fragile than either of their bodies. Mark refused to stop fighting back. Even broken, even barely conscious, he kept getting back up. He could not win. Not yet. He was too new to his powers, too young, too untrained. But he would not give Nolan the surrender he was asking for. And something in that refusal broke through the layers of Viltrumite conditioning in Nolan, in a way that nothing else had ever managed to. Nolan flew away, into space, away from Earth, away from Debbie, away from Mark. And Mark was left on the ground with all of it. That is a weight that does not leave a person. Not quickly, not cleanly. Mark had to go home and look at his mother and somehow find a way to explain what had happened without having any real explanation for it at all. He had to go to school. He had to be a 17-year-old boy in a world that suddenly looked completely different from every angle he tried to look at it. The universe of Invincible does not give its characters clean recovery arcs. It gives them time and complexity and the slow, difficult work of being human, even when you are not entirely human at all. Let the darkness breathe. Let it be quiet for a moment. While Mark was on Earth figuring out who he was without the father he thought he knew, Nolan was somewhere across the galaxy, carrying his own impossible weight. He ended up on a planet called Thraxa, a world of insectoid beings with very short lifespans. And in the years he spent there, years that passed differently than Earth years given the distances involved, he had another child, a half-Viltrumite boy whose entire world existed within a few years of natural lifespan. The Viltrumites eventually came to collect Nolan. He was a traitor to them. He had abandoned his mission on Earth. He had allowed his son to defy the Empire, and so they came, and they took him, and he was imprisoned. But even in prison, Nolan Grayson remained complicated, because underneath all the terrible things he had done and failed to do, underneath the conditioning and the centuries and the violence, there was something that had taken root on Earth. Something soft that he could not entirely destroy in himself, no matter how much of a Viltrumite he tried to be. Meanwhile, on Earth, the machine kept running. Cecil Stedman continued operating the Global Defense Agency with his particular brand of ruthless pragmatism. His relationship with Mark was one of the more fascinating dynamics in the entire story. Two people who genuinely cared about protecting Earth, but had entirely different ideas about what that protection was allowed to cost. Cecil saw bodies as tools and actions as acceptable if they served the right outcome. Mark believed, deeply and stubbornly believed, that how you protected something mattered as much as whether you protected it. These two never fully resolved their tension. It just shifted and evolved and circled around itself the way real disagreements between real people tend to do. There was also the Guardians of the Globe. The original team, the one Nolan had been part of, had been destroyed. They had been killed quickly, ruthlessly, and Nolan had been the one to do it, acting on Viltrumite orders to remove any organized Earth resistance before the conquest began. Their replacements were younger, less experienced, assembled from what was available, and in that team was someone named Atom Eve. If you are still awake, think about Eve for a moment, because she is extraordinary. Atom Eve has the ability to manipulate matter at the molecular level. She can change what things are made of. She can reshape the physical world with a thought. It is one of the most theoretically powerful abilities in the entire story, and it is housed in a person who is thoughtful and warm and struggling in deeply recognizable ways with what to do with the life she has been given. Even Mark found each other across the complicated landscape of being young people with impossible responsibilities. Their relationship did not arrive quickly or easily. It grew the way real things grow, through shared experience and honest conversation, and the particular closeness that comes from surviving difficult things alongside another person. She is the one who eventually does something that reshapes the trajectory of the entire story in ways that matter deeply, but we are drifting through this slowly. There is no need to rush to any particular shore. Let us talk for a moment about the wider universe, because Invincible is not just a story about one planet. Out there in the darkness between stars, there are civilizations of every kind imaginable. There is the Flaxen dimension, a place where time moves at a different rate than it does in our reality, so that every time invaders from that dimension cross over into our space, they age rapidly. What seems like hours of invasion to them is months or years of aging. It is one of the stranger and more melancholy corners of this universe, the idea of a conquering force defeated not by superior power, but by the simple fact that reality itself is hostile to them here. There is Tailskria and the Coalition of Planets, a gathering of worlds that have chosen cooperation over conquest, a kind of opposite of the Viltrumite Empire in its philosophy, fragile and imperfect, but reaching towards something better. And there are other Viltrumites scattered throughout the galaxy. Not just the Empire, individuals, agents, some who are loyal without question, some who are beginning to feel, as Nolan felt, the creeping weight of all the centuries and all the planets and all the lives. One of the most significant of these is a Viltrumite named Anissa, and she is uncomfortable to think about in the way that the best antagonists always are, because her worldview has its own terrible internal logic, and she pursues it with a conviction that is hard to simply dismiss as evil, even when the things she does are genuinely wrong. And then there is Conquest. Sleep is getting closer, let it approach slowly, but let us sit with Conquest for just a moment, because he matters. Conquest is old, ancient old. He has been fighting for the Viltrumite Empire for longer than most civilizations have existed. He has lost pieces of himself along the way, literally. He is missing an arm, missing an eye, and he has simply replaced them and kept going, as if the accumulation of damage only clarifies his purpose rather than diminishing it. He arrives on Earth as a test and a message and a problem that Mark has to deal with, at a stage where Mark is powerful enough to make it a genuine fight, but the cost is enormous. What that fight does to Mark, what it costs him, what it changes in him, is part of the gradual transformation from a boy who became a hero to a man who understands what heroism actually demands. Let us drift now to something quieter, something that hums beneath all the action and the cosmic scale of everything. The domestic life, Debbie Grayson. Debbie found out what her husband was. She found out that the man she loved, the man she had built a life with, the man she had raised a child with, had been something other than what he appeared from the very beginning. Not in the ordinary way that people are complicated and keep parts of themselves private, but in a fundamental way that called into question the nature of every moment they had ever shared. What does a person do with that? Debbie chose to feel it all. She did not disappear into denial. She did not simplify it into clean anger. She sat inside the enormous, complicated grief of loving someone who had deceived her at the deepest possible level, and she kept being a mother, and she kept being herself, and she slowly rebuilt something out of what remained. Her arc is one of the quietest and most genuinely moving in the entire story, because it is about something that does not require superpowers and does not take place across galaxies. It is about the hard, ordinary work of continuing to be a person after a loss that changes the shape of everything. Mark carried the weight of what his father had done in ways that manifested differently over time. There were moments of anger, moments of deep and complicated longing for the father he had believed in, moments of finding things in himself, physical traits, thought patterns, instincts that reminded him of Nolan and not knowing how to feel about that. He also had to keep being invincible. The world did not pause for his processing. There were the Sequids, a hive mind race of small creatures that could attach to a host and take control. There was a mission to Mars that went very wrong in very quiet ways. There were conflicts with other heroes, not in the comic book punching each other over misunderstandings way, but in the more realistic way where people with different philosophies and different lines that they will not cross end up in genuine conflict. There was a version of events, a alternate history woven through the story, showing what happened on Earths where different choices were made, where the Viltrumite conquest succeeded, or where the heroes made different compromises. These glimpses serve as a kind of shadow reflection, a reminder that the world Mark is fighting to protect is not inevitable. It is chosen, it has to be chosen, over and over, by someone willing to pay the price of choosing it. Now, breathe out slowly. The galaxy is very large and very old, and we are just drifting through a small part of it tonight. There is a character named Robot, and his story is one of the more quietly tragic ones in the entire roster. He began as exactly what he appeared to be, a brilliant, analytical, strategic mind operating from behind a mechanical interface, but beneath that was something more fragile and more human than anyone expected. And in the years that followed, as he grew in power and in capability, as the scale of his perspective expanded, he began to make the kinds of decisions that very intelligent people make when they become convinced that they understand something better than everyone else does. He is not a villain in the simple sense. He is someone who loved something and tried to protect it, and chose methods that crossed lines that cannot be uncrossed. And the tragedy of him is that you can follow the thread of his reasoning even as you watch where it leads. The Viltrumite War happens at a scale that the imagination has to stretch to contain. It is not just Earth fighting back. It is a coalition of species, a desperate alliance of worlds that have been under the Empire's shadow for generations, deciding that this is the moment, and this is the fight, and this is worth what it is going to cost. And it does cost. It costs in lives and in planets and in the quieter currencies of what people become in the middle of fighting for survival. Nolan comes back into this story, changed, still complicated. Still carrying the 1,000 years of what he was, but also carrying the Earth years, and Debbie, and Mark, and the Thraxa child, and something that might cautiously be called a different understanding of what life is worth. His reunion with Mark is not a simple forgiveness scene. It is too honest for that. It is two people circling something enormous that exists between them, trying to find a way to hold it together without pretending it is smaller than it is. There is something the story keeps returning to, a theme that runs through everything, like a current beneath still water. The question of what strength is for, the Viltrumites have the clearest possible answer to that question. Strength is for survival and expansion and the imposition of order on a chaotic universe. Their answer is wrong, but it is coherent. It has the terrible elegance of things that are simply logical without being wise. Mark keeps finding a different answer, or rather keeps finding pieces of an answer that assemble slowly over years and injuries and losses. Strength is for protection. But protection of what exactly, and what are you willing to do in the name of it? And when does protection become control? And when does using your strength to impose your idea of safety on someone else make you something uncomfortably close to what you were fighting against? He does not resolve these questions cleanly. He just keeps living inside them. Eve is beside him for so much of this. Her matter manipulation abilities evolve in ways that become important at critical moments. But more than her powers, it is her clarity that matters. She has a way of seeing through the layers to what a situation actually requires, not ruthless clarity, not the cold calculation of a Cecil Stedman, but a warm and grounded kind of seeing that Mark needs more than he usually knows how to say. They build something together. It is built on top of an enormous amount of difficulty and loss, and the particular kind of closeness that comes from being the only two people who fully understand what the other one has been through. It is not a perfect thing, it is a real thing, which is better. The stars outside your window, if you could see them right now, they are very old. The light reaching your eyes left its source so long ago that the star itself might look different now, might have changed, might even be gone. When you look at the sky, you are looking at the past. At messages sent across unimaginable distances by things that do not know you exist, the universe of Invincible feels like that sometimes, like it is made of old light, like the events of its history are still traveling toward consequences that have not yet arrived. There is Alan the alien, who deserves a gentler mention than his name might suggest. He began as a recurring presence, someone who showed up periodically as a kind of checkpoint, a figure from the wider universe who helped remind Mark that Earth was not the whole story. He was warm in a way that felt unexpected for someone of his abilities. He had humor and loyalty and a genuine investment in the coalition and its mission. His relationship with Mark became one of the more uncomplicated sources of goodness in a story that tends toward complicated everything. There are the Sequid Wars, the Martian situations, the various dimensional conflicts, the quiet, terrible accumulation of a world being protected by people who are figuring out protection in real time with real consequences for getting it wrong. There is the matter of what Invincible eventually becomes. Not as a superhero identity but as a person, because Mark Grayson at the end of the major chapters of his story is not the 17-year-old boy who accidentally threw a garbage bag into the upper atmosphere. He is someone who has seen the Viltrumite Empire from the inside and from the outside. Who has fought his own father and found a way back to something that could be called a relationship. Who has lost people and failed people and chosen to keep going anyway, not because he is invincible in the sense of being unbreakable, but because he has decided that being the kind of person who keeps going is who he wants to be. There is a version of the future, glimpsed and hinted at throughout the story, that is staggering in its scope, thousands of years passing, decisions made in the present moment, having consequences that ripple across centuries. The story of Invincible is, at its largest, a story about what a single person choosing to be good, choosing to protect, rather than dominate, choosing love over legacy, what that choice can eventually become when given enough time and enough space to grow. It is not a tidy future. Nothing in this universe is tidy. But there is something in it that looks like hope, the kind of hope that is earned rather than assumed, the kind that knows exactly what it cost. Let your breathing slow down now. Let the space between your thoughts get a little wider. The Viltrumites are out there in the dark between stars. Viltrum, with its terrible, beautiful history, its purge and its empire, and its 1,000 years of conquest, is a place that exists somewhere in the back of the story, even in its quieter moments. A reminder of where things came from and what they could have been if different choices had been made. Nolan Grayson, Omni-Man, is flying somewhere, still complicated, still carrying more history than most minds could hold. Still, somewhere underneath it all, a father. Debbie is living her life in the quiet way that survivors of enormous things learn to do. With more grace than the situation required of her, and more honesty than was comfortable. Cecil Stedman is in an office somewhere, making decisions that he believes are necessary and that cost him something he long ago decided he could afford to spend. Robot is wherever his story took him, still brilliant, still tragic, still the most difficult kind of wrong to look at because it was assembled from pieces that were not wrong on their own. Alan is out there with the coalition, doing the patient work of cooperation across species lines, carrying a optimism that feels radical given everything that exists to justify the opposite. And Mark is still going, still flying, still getting back up. His suit is red and blue, actually, if you have only seen certain adaptations and imagined it otherwise. The comics gave him red and yellow. Both versions are the same boy underneath. Both are someone who found out very early that the universe is larger and stranger and more dangerous than anyone told him, and who chose, very deliberately chose, to face it as a good person anyway. The stars are quiet tonight. The space between galaxies is unimaginably cold and unimaginably vast, and contains within it the histories of civilizations we will never know anything about, who rose and fought and loved and collapsed into dust long before our sun was anything more than a cloud of gas slowly gathering itself together. In that darkness, a boy in a cape is still flying. He is heading somewhere. He is not sure yet if he will arrive in time. He is never quite sure of that. But he is going. Let the story carry you now. You do not have to hold on to any of it. It will be here when you wake up. All these worlds and all these people and all this ancient light, patient as the universe itself, waiting to be rediscovered. The fight is over for tonight. The cities are quiet. The sky is clear. Close your eyes. Picture this. It is 3 a.m. You cannot sleep. Your mind is racing, and somewhere in the back of your brain, a thought creeps in. What if there is something about Invincible Season 2 that you completely missed? What if the lore runs so deep, so dark, so genuinely unsettling, that knowing it will either keep you up even longer or finally give your restless mind something worth chewing on until you drift off? Well, tonight, I am going to give you exactly that. So get comfortable. Pull that blanket up. Close your eyes if you want. Because we are going into the lore, and we are going deep. Invincible Season 2 dropped, and it absolutely shattered expectations. But here is the thing about this show that most people miss when they are watching it for the first time. The surface story, the punching and the drama and the blood and the betrayal, that is just the layer you are supposed to see. Underneath all of that is something much more complex, a mythology that has been building for decades inside the comics, carefully adapted and layered into the animated series in ways that are subtle and patient and genuinely kind of haunting when you start to pull on the threads. So tonight, as you settle in, I want to walk you through the shocking lore buried inside Season 2, the things that explain why characters behave the way they do, the ancient histories that give the conflicts their weight, the cosmic implications that make everything feel so much bigger and heavier than a typical superhero story, and I promise you, by the time we reach the end, you will understand this world in a way that makes it feel almost mythological. Let us start with Nolan Grayson, Omni-Man. Because even though Season 1 ended with his departure and his defeat, Season 2 does not let him off the hook. It deepens him in ways that are genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. When we learn more about his history with the Viltrumite Empire, we begin to understand that Nolan was not simply a soldier following orders. He was a true believer. For most of his life, he genuinely, deeply, in his core believed that the Viltrumite way was the correct and superior way to organize civilization. The idea that strength determines worth. The idea that conquest is a form of upliftment. These were not things he was coerced into believing. They were things he was raised with from childhood on a planet where these values were as natural as breathing. And here is where the lore gets disturbing. The Viltrumite Empire did not achieve its dominance through simple military might. They did it through a process that is, when you really think about it, a form of civilizational horror. Entire worlds were not just conquered, they were absorbed. The local populations were evaluated. Those deemed worthy, meaning those who could serve the empire, were integrated. Those deemed unworthy were simply removed, not enslaved, not imprisoned. Removed. The Viltrumites have been doing this across the galaxy for thousands of years, and Season 2 begins to pull back the curtain on how many worlds have experienced this fate. Now let your mind drift to that for a moment. Thousands of years, world after world, and Earth, our little blue planet, has been quietly sitting in their sights for decades, with one of their most decorated soldiers living here, watching us, and for a long time, genuinely preparing to hand us over. That is the weight Invincible carries now, not just the personal betrayal of a father, but the cosmic inheritance of being the son of someone who was, for centuries of interstellar history, one of the most effective agents of civilizational destruction in the known universe. Moving now into the sequids, because if you have not given these creatures their proper due, you have been sleeping on one of the most genuinely creepy lore threads in the entire series. The sequids look small. They look almost silly at first glance. But what they represent is a kind of horror that feels very different from the physical violence of the Viltrumites. The Viltrumites conquer through strength. The sequids conquer through replacement. What the sequids do is they do not destroy the mind they inhabit. They do not kill the host. They layer themselves on top of the host's consciousness, using the host's own memories and personality and emotional responses as a kind of camouflage. The person you knew is still technically there, but they are underneath now, and the thing operating their body has access to everything they ever knew, everything they ever felt, everything that made them who they were. And it is using all of that to pass as them. Think about the existential terror of that. Not being killed, not being imprisoned, just being buried inside your own mind while something else lives your life. And Season 2 expands on the threat of the Sequids in ways that make it clear they are not just a single-planet problem. Their potential as a galactic threat is something the narrative begins to acknowledge, and the lore behind why they evolved this particular survival mechanism is genuinely fascinating if you let it sit with you in the dark. They are survivors. That is the ugly truth about the Sequids. They developed this parasitic intelligence as a response to being a vulnerable species on a hostile world. They found the most efficient path to survival, which was not to develop weapons or shields or armies. It was to become invisible by wearing the faces of those who would threaten them. In a galaxy full of Viltrumite-level predators, the Sequids found a way to persist. And whether that makes them villains or just organisms doing what organisms do is a question the lore leaves deliberately unanswered. Now let us move into something that does not get talked about nearly enough, which is the Cecil Stedman layer of the lore. Cecil is one of the most morally complex figures in this universe, and Season 2 continues to develop him as someone who operates in the space between necessary evil and genuine monstrousness. But to understand why Cecil is the way he is, you have to understand what the Global Defense Agency actually is within the lore of this world. The GDA is not just a government organization that manages superhero activity. It is, in the context of this fictional world, the Earth's most sophisticated attempt to prepare for exactly the kind of threat that Nolan Grayson represented. Cecil has known, or at least suspected, for years that superhero culture on Earth could be infiltrated at the highest levels. He has been building contingencies and backup plans and morally compromised arrangements for decades because he genuinely believes that without those things, humanity does not survive contact with the larger universe. And here is the lore piece that makes Cecil genuinely tragic rather than simply villainous. He is right. Within the logic of this world, Cecil's willingness to do terrible things has, by his own accounting, saved more lives than the traditional heroic approaches. The horrible arrangements he has made, the morally bankrupt deals he has struck, the secrets he has buried, they have, in the calculus of the story's universe, been effective. The horror is not that Cecil is wrong. The horror is that the universe he lives in seems to confirm his worldview at every turn. That is the kind of moral weight that Invincible Season 2 sits inside, and it is the kind of thing that your mind can quietly turn over in the dark without needing to be actively disturbing. It is philosophically heavy rather than viscerally shocking, and it makes for very good late-night thinking. Let the screen fade for a moment. Let the sounds around you settle, because the next piece of lore I want to bring you into is probably the most cosmically significant thing happening in the background of Season 2, and it involves the Viltrumite population crisis in ways that recontextualize everything. Here is something that the show reveals and then asks you to just carry with you. The Viltrumite Empire, despite its terrifying military dominance, is demographically on the edge of collapse. The empire that has conquered hundreds of worlds and eliminated thousands of civilizations is, in terms of pure numbers, a tiny population. The reason for this comes down to Viltrumite biology and history. A plague, many generations back, nearly wiped them out. And while they survived it, and while the survivors became the almost indestructible beings we know them as today, the population never fully recovered. This means that every single Viltrumite life has enormous strategic value to the Empire. Losing one Viltrumite soldier is not like losing one human soldier in terms of the arithmetic of power. It is a wound to a gene pool that is already stretched thin across a galaxy-spanning empire. And this biological vulnerability, hidden under layers of cultural invincibility and warrior mythology, is the secret crack in the foundation of everything the Viltrumites have built. And it is why Nolan matters so much, and why Mark matters even more. Half-human, half-Viltrumite hybrids may represent something the pure Viltrumites never expected, which is a genetic pathway that actually diversifies and potentially strengthens a dying bloodline. The empire that enslaves worlds to serve Viltrumite supremacy may ultimately depend for its survival on the very mixing of blood it considers inferior. That irony is written into the bones of Season 2's lore, and it is worth sitting with as you drift. Let us go somewhere different now. Let us talk about Angstrom Levy, because his story in Season 2 is not just a villain arc. It is a meditation on perspective and victimhood, and the way trauma can calcify into something monstrous. Angstrom Levy has the ability to open portals to alternate dimensions, and in his backstory, he had a genuine ambition that was, on its surface, not evil. He wanted to absorb the knowledge of alternate versions of himself from across countless parallel realities, to become a repository of accumulated human wisdom. It is almost a beautiful idea if you strip away what went wrong. What went wrong is that Mark, through a chain of events and misunderstandings, contributed to an accident that destroyed Angstrom's plan and left him physically and mentally transformed. And Angstrom Levy, in the calculus of his own experience, is not the villain of his story. He is the victim. He is the man who wanted to do something extraordinary for humanity and had it taken from him by a young, careless superhero who was not even paying full attention. The lore implication here is vast and underexplored in conversations about this show. Angstrom has now traveled through countless alternate realities and has gathered intelligence from versions of the Invincible story, where Mark becomes something much worse. He has seen timelines, he has seen outcomes. And in many of them, Mark Grayson does not stay heroic. In many alternate realities, the version of Invincible that emerges is not the one who resisted his father's legacy, it is the one who inherited it. So when Angstrom comes at Mark with such overwhelming hatred, it is not just personal grievance. It is the accumulated testimony of countless universes whispering that this young man in the superhero suit is dangerous, and the terrifying thing the lore leaves open is whether Angstrom might, in some fundamental way, be processing real information. Now, as your breathing slows and the room feels a little quieter, I want to bring you into the emotional core of Season 2 lore, which is really about legacy and what we inherit, and whether we can escape the gravity of where we come from. Mark Grayson is caught in a position that is genuinely mythological in its structure. He is the son of a god who turned out to be something terrible. In the great mythologies of human civilization, this is a pattern we recognize: the child of the destroyer, the heir to the throne of something monstrous. And across every culture that has told this kind of story, the central question is always the same: does the blood determine the fate? The Viltrumite ideology says yes, absolutely yes. Blood is everything. Lineage is destiny. Strength determines worth, and worth is heritable. That is the universe Nolan grew up in, the philosophy that was embedded in him like code, and it is the philosophy he unconsciously passed along through simply being Mark's father, not through direct teaching, but through the way power was normalized in their home. Through the casual demonstrations of strength, through the unspoken assumption that the Grayson men were exceptional in a way that set them apart. And Mark has to dismantle all of that from the inside, while also being genuinely, physically, almost irresistibly powerful. That is the psychological trap the lore has set for him. The more powerful he becomes, the more Viltrumite he becomes, the stronger the pull of the identity he is trying to reject. And Season 2 watches him navigate that with all the grace and awkwardness and pain of someone who does not have a map. Let me tell you about the Immortal, because his lore connection to the history of Earth adds another layer that I think people underappreciate. The Immortal, as his name suggests, has been alive for an extraordinarily long time. He has watched human civilization rise and develop and expand. He has memory that stretches back through historical eras that most people only know as chapters in books. And what this means within the lore of the Invincible universe is that he represents a kind of institutional memory that no other character can offer. The immortal remembers what Earth was before the superhero age. He remembers the transition. He carries in his ancient mind a continuity of human experience that gives him a perspective on the current cosmic threats that is both invaluable and deeply melancholy. Because he has seen civilizations fall, he has watched things that seemed permanent dissolve into dust. And now he is watching Earth stand on the edge of something that his centuries of experience tell him may be unsurvivable without extraordinary choices. There is something very quiet and very sad about the immortal when you layer the lore over his appearances in Season 2. He is not optimistic in the way young heroes are. He is determined in the way that survivors are, which is a very different energy. He keeps going, not because he believes everything will be fine. He keeps going because stopping is not something he knows how to do anymore. Now we should spend some time in the dark with the Viltrumite warrior Conquest, because within the lore of the Empire, Conquest represents a specific philosophical position that the show uses almost as a counter-argument to everything Mark believes. Conquest is ancient even by Viltrumite standards. He has fought on more worlds than most Viltrumites have even heard of. He has been injured and has recovered and has come back stronger each time, and that cycle of damage and return has become his identity. He does not fear death. He does not particularly fear pain. What drives him is the pure philosophy of dominance as natural order. In Conquest's worldview, the galaxy is not a collection of civilizations with equal rights to existence. It is an ecosystem, and apex predators are not morally responsible for the existence of prey. This is not a position Conquest holds cynically or even particularly aggressively. It is simply his understanding of how existence works, and that makes him genuinely chilling in a way that purely sadistic villains are not, because you cannot reach him with appeals to empathy or shared humanity. He is not suppressing those things. He simply never had them in the framework he uses to understand the world. His confrontation with Mark in the lore is not just a physical fight. It is an argument. It is the Viltrumite philosophy at its most distilled, going up against whatever Mark has managed to build in opposition to it. And the fact that the fight is so brutal, so grinding, so close to going the other way, is the lore making a point. The argument is not easy to win. The philosophy Conquest represents has thousands of years of empirical success behind it. Defeating it requires more than good intentions. Let your body sink deeper into wherever you are resting right now. Let the sounds of the story wash over you, because I want to take you now into something softer but no less significant, which is the lore around Amber and what she represents in the architecture of Mark's life during Season 2. Amber is often framed in fan discussions as a supporting character, someone in Mark's orbit, rather than a figure with her own lore weight, but I think that fundamentally misreads what the narrative is doing with her. Amber represents the gravitational pull of a normal life. She is not a plot device. She is the lore argument for why any of this is worth fighting for. In a story filled with cosmic empires and ancient warriors and existential threats to civilization, Amber is a young woman who is sharp and principled and does not have superpowers and is choosing to be with someone whose life has become genuinely terrifying. The lore of that choice is actually profound. She is not staying with Mark because the story requires her to. She is staying because she has looked at the chaos and made a conscious decision about what she values. And when that relationship strains under the weight of everything Mark is carrying, it is the story saying something important. The normal life does not wait. The people who anchor us to who we want to be have their own limits, their own needs, their own timelines. And in the broader cosmological lore of Invincible, where civilizations are destroyed and legacies span millennia, the quiet human story of whether two young people can maintain trust under impossible pressure is somehow just as weighty as anything happening between Viltrumites. Now let us drift into the Thraxan chapter of the lore, because what happened on Thraxa during Nolan's time there is one of the more morally complicated pieces of the entire mythology, and Season 2 forces us to look at it directly. Nolan, after leaving Earth, settled on Thraxa. He lived among a species with an extremely short natural lifespan, relatively speaking, and he fell in love and had a child. And the lore implications of this are genuinely strange and uncomfortable when you examine them. Nolan, who spent decades on Earth building a family and preparing to eventually hand the planet over to an empire, who fathered a child he came to genuinely love and then left, went to another world and did a version of the same thing again, faster, because Thraxan life moves faster. But structurally similar. What does that tell us about Nolan Grayson? It tells us that his capacity for attachment is real and is not something that coexists easily with his Viltrumite identity. He is not a creature without feeling. He is a creature with feeling who chose for most of his life to let ideology override it, and who now finds himself, in Season 2, having to confront the wreckage of every place he has loved and left. The half-brother that Mark discovers in this arc is not just a plot twist. It is the lore rhyming with itself. Another child of Nolan, growing up in the shadow of a father who is history in the making and a disaster in the personal. Another inheritance of power and complication. Another heir to the legacy of a man who has never quite figured out how to stay. As the night settles in around you, I want to bring the energy down even further and talk about something the lore of Season 2 handles in the background, which is the question of what heroism actually costs on the cosmic scale of this universe. Most superhero narratives handle the cost of heroism in personal terms. The hero loses relationships, struggles with identity, misses ordinary life, and Invincible does all of that. But it also asks a question that very few superhero stories are willing to sit with, which is whether individual heroism is even the right tool for threats of this size. The Viltrumite Empire is not a villain that can be punched into surrender. It is a civilization. It is a thousands-year-old institutional structure with a culture and a military and a population spread across the galaxy. Stopping it is not a matter of finding the right superhero moment. It requires strategy and alliance building and sacrifice on scales that individual courage cannot reach. And the lore of Season 2 is quietly building toward the acknowledgement that Mark, for all his power and his good heart, cannot solve this the way superhero instincts suggest. That tension between the heroic individual and the scale of the problem is the philosophical engine running underneath all of the action and drama. And it is something that your mind can follow gently down into sleep, turning it over and over like a smooth stone in your hand. Let us touch on the Guardians of the Globe for a moment, because the institutional lore of that team in Season 2 is doing something interesting. The original Guardians were murdered by Omni-Man. The new Guardians are assembled in the wake of that trauma, and what the lore is tracking in Season 2 is the question of whether a team built on the ashes of a betrayal can develop genuine trust. Cecil assembled this team. And Cecil, as we have established, is not a figure who inspires uncomplicated trust. Every member of the New Guardians is operating with a certain awareness that they are, at some level, pieces on Cecil's board, and yet they are also people with their own histories and powers and reasons to fight. The team dynamic in Season 2 is the lore working through the question of whether institutional cynicism and genuine heroism can occupy the same space. The answer the story seems to be reaching toward is complicated and not entirely comforting. Yes, they can coexist, but the coexistence has costs. And the people who pay those costs are usually the ones who brought the genuine heroism to the arrangement. Now I want to bring you somewhere very specific in the lore. I want to talk about the emotional architecture of what the show is doing with Debbie Grayson, Mark's mother, in Season 2. Because her storyline is, in the context of all this cosmic lore, the most human thing the narrative contains, and it is handled with a quietness that I think is easy to underestimate. Debbie spent decades of her life married to a man who was, she eventually learned, an alien spy. Everything she thought she knew about her marriage, her family, the life she built, had a layer of unreality underneath it, and yet the feelings were real. The love was real, or at least the experience of love was real, and the difference between those two things is where Debbie lives in Season 2. The law question her story asks is genuinely philosophical. If someone loves you genuinely and also deceives you fundamentally, what is the truth of that relationship? Was it love? Was it manipulation? Can it be both? And does the answer change what was real about your own life? These are questions the law does not answer because they cannot be answered. They can only be lived with. And watching Debbie navigate that in Season 2, while the cosmic machinery of Viltrumite empire and interdimensional invasion grinds away around her, is the show at its most honestly human. Her grief is not operatic. It is the quiet, grinding, daily kind, the kind that is there when you wake up and still there when you try to sleep, the kind that becomes a companion you never asked for, and in the context of all the world-ending lore around her, that ordinary human grief is somehow the most devastating thing the show contains. Let the weight of that settle over you like a heavy blanket, like something warm and still. The lore of Invincible Season 2 is ultimately a story about inheritance, about what gets passed down through bloodlines and through cultures and through civilizations. About whether the things we inherit determine us or whether we can choose our way out of them. About whether the universe is fundamentally ordered around power or whether that is just a story powerful things tell to justify their existence. The Viltrumites believe in the inheritance of strength. Cecil believes in the inheritance of institutional knowledge and cold pragmatism. The Sequids believe in the inheritance of survival by any means necessary. Angstrom Levy carries the inherited testimony of infinite alternate histories. The Immortal carries the inherited memory of a civilization's entire arc. Debbie carries the inherited love and grief of a life built on a foundation she did not fully know. And Mark Grayson, floating in the middle of all of it, is trying to figure out what he wants to inherit. From his father, from humanity, from the best version of what a hero could be. He does not have the answer yet. Season 2 is honest about that. He is making it up as he goes, the way all of us do, just with more bruising. There is something almost comforting about that, in the way that honest things are often more comforting than false reassurances. He does not know. He is trying anyway. He gets knocked down and comes back and tries to be better than what made him. That is not a cosmic story. That is a human story. And somehow, wrapped in all this lore about empires and plagues and parasites and ancient warriors, it is the most resonant thing of all. So, as your eyes grow heavy and the details of the lore begin to soften at the edges, let this be the last thing you carry into sleep. Every enormous thing in this universe, every empire and every existential threat and every ancient power, it all began somewhere small. A choice, a belief, a connection between people who were just trying to figure out who they were and what they owed the world. The shocking lore of Invincible Season 2 is full of the enormous and the terrible and the cosmically vast. But underneath all of it, beating quietly at the center, is the same thing that beats at the center of every story worth telling. Something small and ordinary and impossibly fragile trying to survive in a universe that is very large and does not always care. And that, maybe, is the most lore-appropriate way to fall asleep, knowing that the enormous things are real and frightening and worth understanding. And knowing that the small things, the human things, the morning light things, they are still here too, still mattering, still being worth the fight. Close your eyes now. The Empire can wait. The lore will still be there when you wake up. For now, just drift. The story knows where it is going. And so, eventually, will you. Look, before you close your eyes tonight, let me take you somewhere. Somewhere that exists between the panels of a comic book and the screens where animated blood has made grown adults physically gasp out loud. We are going deep into the world of Invincible, and specifically, we are talking about what Season 4 could mean, what the lore is building toward, and why this story is one of the most quietly devastating pieces of science fiction ever told. Get comfortable. Adjust your pillow. Let the weight of the day start to fall away, because the Invincible universe has a way of pulling you in so gently, so warmly, and then doing something so unexpected that you find yourself reconsidering everything you thought you knew about superheroes. Tonight we are going to explore that universe together. Let us start at the beginning of where we currently are, because context matters enormously when it comes to this story. Season 3 of Invincible left the world in a place that felt both triumphant and deeply unsettling. Mark Grayson, our boy, our complicated and earnest half-Viltrumite hero, had survived things that would have shattered most people, not just physically, though the physical punishment he takes in this show is genuinely staggering, but emotionally, psychologically. The weight of what it means to be invincible had grown heavier with every passing episode, and by the time Season 3 concluded, we were left with threads dangling in the most tantalizing ways. The Viltrumite Empire is still out there. And that matters more than almost anything else we could talk about tonight. See, here is the thing about the Viltrumites that makes them such a uniquely compelling antagonist force. They are not evil in the way comic book villains are traditionally evil. They do not twirl metaphorical mustaches. They do not destroy things for the pleasure of destruction. They are conquerors who genuinely believe in the righteousness of their conquest. They see the spreading of Viltrumite genetics and Viltrumite culture across the universe as a service to lesser civilizations. They are the most dangerous kind of enemy because they are absolutely certain they are right. Nolan Grayson, Omni-Man himself, was one of them, was the perfect embodiment of their ideology, and yet something happened that should have been impossible according to Viltrumite logic. He changed. Love, something the Viltrumites essentially view as a biological inefficiency, broke through decades of conditioning and mission programming and turned the greatest weapon the Empire had ever deployed on Earth into something approaching a father, a husband, a person. That transformation is the emotional heart of everything the lore of Season 4 will be built around. Now let yourself breathe a little slower. The room around you is quiet. The story we are exploring together is one worth following into sleep. The comic source material by Robert Kirkman gives us a roadmap for where this story goes, though the television series has always been willing to reorder, expand, and occasionally reimagine things in ways that serve the screen. So when we talk about what Season 4 might contain, we are talking about a combination of what the comics established and what the show has been carefully constructing. One of the most significant lore elements that Season 4 will almost certainly grapple with is the full nature of the Viltrumite War and its aftermath. The Empire, despite appearing all-powerful and unstoppable, has a secret that took millennia to create and cannot be easily solved. Their population is staggeringly small. The Viltrumites reproduce slowly. They are functionally immortal, which means their population does not turn over quickly, and a plague long ago decimated their numbers in ways the Empire has never fully recovered from. This is why Mark matters so much. This is why Nolan mattered. Not because one man with superhuman strength changes a war, but because half Viltrumite children can be born to nearly any humanoid species in the universe. The Empire needs genetic diversity. It needs new blood. And Earth, with its billions of humans and its surprising genetic compatibility with Viltrumite biology, represents the most extraordinary breeding ground they have ever encountered. When you understand that, Nolan's original mission to Earth takes on a different shade of horror. He was not just a scout, he was a seed, and Mark is the result of that mission succeeding beyond the Empire's wildest projections. Let the quiet settle around you. Outside, the world is doing what it does. In here, we are somewhere between waking and the first soft edges of sleep. The character who looms largest over the lore leading into Season 4 is someone we have been circling for a while now, Thrag. General Thrag is one of the most carefully constructed villains in the entire Invincible mythology, and understanding him is essential to understanding where the story is heading. Thrag was the general of all Viltrumite forces. He was the most powerful Viltrumite warrior alive, and given that Viltrumites are the strongest beings in the known universe, that distinction is almost impossible to fully comprehend. He is not just strong, he is strategic. Patient in the way that only beings who have lived for thousands of years can be patient. He thinks in centuries, he plans across generations, and he had a secret that, when revealed, changes everything about the power dynamics of the Viltrumite Empire. Thrag was the secret heir to the Viltrumite throne. He had kept this information hidden for so long and so completely that even the Empire itself did not know. His plan was to continue as general, continue as the most trusted military mind in the Empire, and eventually, when the timing was perfect, assert his claim to a power that he had always technically possessed. But the Viltrum Empire was dismantled before that plan could fully execute. So where does Thrag go when the Empire falls? Where does a being of his intelligence and power and patience go when the structure he has served and secretly manipulated for millennia no longer exists in its original form? He starts over, quietly, methodically. He builds something new. This is the lore that Season 4 will be planting seeds around, and it is genuinely fascinating to think about, because Thrag represents a kind of threat that Mark has never truly faced before. Not just power, not just ideology, but a mind that operates on a timescale that humans and half-humans simply cannot compete with on natural terms. Your breathing is slower now. The story is carrying you forward. Let us talk about Mark himself for a moment, because the lore of Season 4 is not just external threats and cosmic empires. It is the internal journey of a young man who has been aging through the kind of experiences that no coming-of-age story was ever designed to contain. Mark started this story as a teenager, waiting for his powers to arrive. He wanted to be like his dad. He wanted to be a hero in the straightforward, uncomplicated way that teenagers imagine heroism. He got his powers, and then he discovered who his father really was, and that discovery fractured something fundamental in his understanding of himself and the world. Every season since has been Mark trying to figure out who he is, when the simplest answer he ever had turns out to be built on a lie. By the time we reach the lore space of Season 4, Mark is someone who has fought wars, lost friends, loved deeply, been broken and rebuilt. He is someone who carries the Viltrumite legacy inside his DNA and has chosen, actively chosen, to use that legacy in service of protection rather than conquest. But choices like that do not go unchallenged. The Viltrumite way is not passive. It does not simply allow defection to go unpunished or unaddressed. And Mark's continued existence as a symbol of what a Viltrumite could choose to be is, depending on who you ask, either the most inspiring thing in the universe or the most dangerous. The Cecil Stedman element is one of the lore threads that Season 4 will need to address in significant ways. Cecil, who runs the Global Defense Agency, is one of the most morally complex characters in a show full of morally complex characters. He is not a villain. He is not a hero. He is a man who has dedicated his life to protecting humanity, using every tool available to him, including tools that most heroes would refuse to touch. His relationship with Mark is a constant negotiation between genuine respect and fundamental disagreement about methods. Cecil sees the big picture in a way that involves accepting terrible costs. Mark sees the cost in terms of specific people, specific suffering, and refuses to abstract that away. This tension is going to matter enormously as the threats of Season 4 scale up, because the kind of threats coming require the kind of response that neither Cecil nor Mark can provide alone, and working together means both of them compromising parts of themselves that they have built their entire identities around. Let the story drift with you now. You do not have to hold on to every detail. Just let the world of Invincible exist around you like a slowly expanding universe. Atom Eve is another piece of lore that deserves deep attention when thinking about Season 4. Her powers have been consistently underexplored relative to their actual potential, and the lore of the comics suggests that her ability to manipulate matter at a molecular level might be the single most powerful capability of any character in the entire story. Think about what that means. Not strength, not speed, not energy projection, the ability to rearrange the fundamental building blocks of physical reality. With enough focus and enough willingness, Atom Eve can do essentially anything. She can heal, she can destroy, she can create, she can, theoretically, unmake things at a level that even Viltrumite invulnerability cannot fully account for. The emotional weight around Eve in Season 4 comes from the relationship between her and Mark, which has been one of the genuine emotional anchors of the series. These are two people who found each other while both of them were figuring out who they were supposed to be. Their connection has survived things that most relationships cannot survive, and going forward, the question of what their future looks like, when the future is so uncertain, when every conflict could be the last one, becomes one of the most tender and devastating through lines in the lore. The Guardians of the Globe in Season 4 will be operating in a landscape that has been fundamentally reshaped by everything that came before. The team that existed at the start of this story does not resemble what came after. There have been deaths, replacements, betrayals, reformations. By this point, the Guardians represent a kind of institutional resilience, the idea that the structure of protection matters even when the specific people inside it keep changing. Rexplode was one of the characters whose arc completed in ways that changed how the entire group understood what it meant to be a hero. His sacrifice was not the kind of heroic death that gets celebrated with statues and speeches. It was messy and complicated and came from a place of genuine love and genuine guilt existing simultaneously. That is the kind of emotional complexity that makes Invincible different from almost everything else in the superhero genre. The multiverse element, which the show has been carefully introducing, opens up lore territory in Season 4 that is both exhilarating and potentially dangerous from a storytelling perspective. The Invincible, from another dimension, who we have already met, represents something philosophically thorny. What does it mean when the worst version of yourself is a version that simply made different choices under different pressures? What does it mean when your greatest enemy and your greatest cautionary tale share your face? The Angstrom-Levy thread connects to this. Levy, with his ability to travel between dimensions and his very personal vendetta against Mark, represents the way that good intentions corroded by suffering and paranoia can create genuine monsters. He believed he was trying to help parallel versions of humanity. He ended up becoming something that endangered all of them. There is a lesson in there that the show will not state directly, because Invincible is wise enough to trust its audience. Let the darkness behind your closed eyes fill with the stars of the Invincible universe, each one a solar system with its own story, its own civilizations, its own versions of this conflict playing out. The Sequids deserve mention in any serious discussion of Season 4 lore. These creatures, parasitic organisms that can control hosts on a neural level, represent a different kind of threat than the Viltrumites. The Viltrumites are overwhelming in their directness. The Sequids are insidious. They spread through connection, through contact, through the very biological impulse toward community that makes social species vulnerable. Their connection to the Martian civilization and to the larger cosmic ecology of the Invincible universe creates lore implications that Season 4 may begin to address more fully. Because the threats are not isolated, they exist in relation to each other. A weakened Earth that has been defending against one threat is more vulnerable to another. The universe does not take turns politely. The coalition of planets is the political structure that exists on the cosmic scale, attempting to do for multiple civilizations what the Guardians of the Globe attempt to do for Earth. Their relationship with what remains of the Viltrumite situation is delicate and complicated in ways that Season 4 will need to navigate. Because some member civilizations remember the Viltrumite Empire with a specific kind of terror, the way you remember something that unmade your entire world, and the presence of half Viltrumites operating in good faith does not erase that terror automatically. Alan the Alien, who has become one of the show's most beloved characters, occupies a fascinating position in this lore. He started as almost a comedic element, the alien who tests Earth's champions in increasingly awkward ways. He became something far more significant. His friendship with Mark is one of the genuine warmths in a story that can be very cold, and his connection to the Coalition, combined with his own extraordinary physical capabilities, makes him a key player in whatever cosmic chess is being set up for Season 4. There is something worth sitting with as you drift closer to sleep. The reason Invincible resonates as deeply as it does, The reason people who do not normally care about superhero stories find themselves completely undone by it is because underneath all of the cosmic lore and the superhuman conflict, it is a story about fathers and sons. It is a story about what you inherit from the people who made you. It is a story about whether the things that were done in your name, before you had a name, define you. It is a story about whether love can override programming, whether human connection is a weakness, or whether it is the only thing in the universe that actually matters. Nolan Grayson became Omni-Man and lived a lie for decades, and then he became something else, because a child looked up at him with complete trust and called him Dad. There is no Viltrumite strength that can make that moment small. There is no empire that can conquer what that moment meant. Season 4 will continue exploring what Nolan is now, not what he was, not what the Empire made him, what he is choosing to be. And that journey, taking place alongside his son's own continued evolution, is the emotional architecture that everything else is built on top of. The relationship between Mark and his younger brother Oliver is another lore element that carries significant weight going forward. Oliver is a full Viltrumite Thraxan hybrid, and his development has been accelerated beyond anything a normal childhood would contain. He aged at an extraordinary rate in his early years. He has ideas about heroism and conflict resolution that differ from Mark's in ways that reflect the different circumstances of their childhoods. Where Mark grew up believing in the human values his mother instilled, believing in the careful consideration of cost and consequence, Oliver has a more impatient sense of what necessary action looks like. He sees suffering and he wants to end it now, by whatever means end it fastest. That impulse is not monstrous, it comes from genuine compassion. But the lore of this story has shown us repeatedly what happens when good intentions bypass the hard work of ethical consideration. The brothers' dynamic in Season 4, as both of them continue to grow into the full scope of their capabilities and their responsibilities, will be one of the threads most worth following. Let the voices in your head go quiet now. Let the story do the work. You are warm and the dark is soft, and the universe of Invincible exists somewhere at the edges of awareness, turning slowly. The Immortal is a character whose very existence in Season 4 lore carries a particular kind of weight. A man who has literally lived through all of recorded human history, who has died and returned so many times that continuity of self becomes a philosophical puzzle. What does legacy mean to someone who will outlive every legacy? What does protection mean when you have watched everything you protected crumble eventually into dust? His relationship with the current version of the Guardians, and specifically with the institutional memory of what superhero teams are supposed to be and do, gives Season 4 a living connection to the history that all of these present conflicts were shaped by. The question of Earth's readiness for what is coming is a lore thread that Season 4 will be wrestling with in genuine ways. The planet has been invaded, defended, damaged, and recovered across the run of this series. The people of Earth are not entirely unaware that they live in a universe that contains threats beyond human imagining, but awareness and preparation are different things, and the scale of what the lore is building toward may exceed anything that any preparation could account for. Cecil's various projects, his attempts to create or cultivate defenders capable of operating at the level required by cosmic-scale threats, represent the human response to an inhuman problem, resourceful, creative, ethically compromised in the ways that all effective intelligence work tends to be ethically compromised. Season 4 will test whether those preparations were enough. There is a villain who exists at the periphery of where the lore is pointing, one whose significance might not be immediately obvious, but who represents the kind of threat that reshapes everything. Without going too deep into specific reveals, the idea that a civilization or individual could have been building toward a specific moment across a time frame that dwarfs human civilization itself, that is the scale of ambition that Season 4 is capable of engaging with. The show has never been afraid of scale. It has also never let scale replace intimacy. The greatest achievement of Invincible as a narrative is that it can move from a moment of planetary destruction to a moment of two people sitting together and talking honestly, and both moments feel equally important. The cosmic and the personal exist at the same level of consequence. Your body is heavy in a comfortable way now. The thoughts of the day have receded. There is just the story and the dark and the slow drift. The art of what the show does with moral ambiguity is worth meditating on as we move through this lore. Consider the Viltrumites again. They are the primary antagonistic force. They have committed atrocities on a scale that the word atrocity barely contains. And yet the most interesting Viltrumites in the story are interesting precisely because they contain the capacity for something else. Nolan made a choice. That choice had consequences. Those consequences are still unfolding. What Season 4 asks, in the lore space it is building, is whether one person's change can seed something larger, whether the exception can become the new rule, whether a civilization that has been defined for millennia by one set of values can genuinely transform, or whether the most you can hope for is a few individuals finding a different way while the larger machine keeps turning. These are not light questions. They are the questions that the 21st century keeps asking in different forms about human institutions, about systemic change, about whether individuals matter against structural forces. Invincible asks them through the lens of an impossibly strong young man who bleeds a lot and loves people deeply and refuses to stop believing that things can be better. The Flaxans, the aliens who experience time differently when attempting to invade Earth, represent one of the more haunting pieces of lore in the existing narrative. The specific tragedy of beings whose biology made sustained invasion impossible, who aged thousands of years in the course of a few minutes on Earth, is both a defense mechanism and an accidental horror. Season 4 may revisit the longer-term consequences of those encounters. Monster Girl and Robot, whose arcs have taken them through one of the most unsettling power dynamic explorations in the entire story, exist in a lore space for Season 4 that is genuinely unpredictable. What they became to each other in the Flaxan dimension during the subjective centuries they spent there has created a relationship that defies easy categorization. What they are now, returning to a world that aged mere hours while they aged entire lifetimes, is a kind of temporal alienation that the show is uniquely equipped to explore. Robot's transformation, the choices he made, and the logic he used to justify them represent another iteration of the show's central philosophical concern. Brilliant minds convinced of their own righteousness, making unilateral decisions on behalf of people who never asked for that particular burden. Cecil does it, Robot did it, the Viltrumites do it at a civilizational scale. The show keeps asking who gave you the right, and keeps providing complicated answers. The depth is taking you now. The edges of the story are becoming soft. This is how lore works at the boundary of sleep. It becomes something more like feeling than information. The universe of Invincible exists not as facts to remember, but as a weight in the chest, a particular kind of caring about fictional people that says something real about what we value. Season 4 will be, if the source material and the show's own trajectory are any guide, the season where the stakes become undeniable, not just for Earth, not just for the Viltrumite situation, but for the larger cosmic order of things. The show has been building toward a confrontation that operates at a scale that forces every character to reckon with what they actually believe when easy options are no longer available. Mark will be asked to be more Viltrumite than he has ever been willing to be. He will be asked to use the full extent of what his biology makes possible in service of what his values demand. That tension, the tension between nature and choice, between inheritance and identity, is the tension the whole story has been building since the very first episode. And he will answer it in a way that is characteristically Mark, imperfect, costly, deeply human in all the ways that count. Think about what it means that the most powerful beings in the Invincible universe, the Viltrumites, keep being undone by love. Keep being changed or stopped or redeemed by the thing they consider weakness. There is something in there that the show means for us to carry, not as a lesson delivered from a podium, but as a discovery made in the gut during a moment when the animation does something gorgeous and the voice acting lands with impossible precision. The music of the show is worth noting as a lore element in itself. The choices made in terms of how scenes are scored, the way certain character themes carry emotional information before dialogue even begins. This is craft operating at a high level. Season 4 will continue that tradition, using sound to create meaning that visual storytelling alone cannot fully achieve. As you move closer to sleep now, let the images come softly. The floating city of Invincible's future, the stars that the Coalition navigates, the specific shade of blue that Atom Eve uses when she is working, Mark's face when he is trying to be brave about something that is genuinely scaring him, Nolan sitting somewhere, looking at something he did not expect to love. These are the images the lore is built from. Season 4 is coming to a story that has earned every emotional moment it is going to deliver. It is coming to characters who have been developed with the kind of care that makes their suffering real and their triumphs meaningful. It is coming to a universe that has been constructed with enough internal logic and enough philosophical ambition that it rewards exactly this kind of slow, close attention. You do not have to worry about the details right now. The lore will be there when you return to it. The Viltrumites will still be formidable. Thrag will still be patient and terrifying and waiting. Mark will still be trying. Nolan will still be becoming. Eve will still be the most quietly powerful person in any room she enters. The story is not going anywhere. And tonight, you have followed it deep enough to understand why it matters. You have let the universe of Invincible exist in the space behind your eyes, complicated and beautiful, and full of the specific kind of hope that only makes sense when you know exactly how much it costs. The world of Season 4 is waiting. Everything is being set in motion. The threads are alive and pulling toward something that the show has been building toward for 3 extraordinary seasons now. But that is for tomorrow, or another night, or whenever the story calls you back. For now, let it go. Let the cosmic wars settle into quiet. Let Mark rest. Let Nolan sit with his choices in peace for a moment. Let Eve exist in the softness of something that is not a crisis. Let all of it drift. The lore keeps. The universe turns slowly. The story holds. And you are here, in the dark, at the edge of sleep, having spent time in a world that reminded you, the way the best stories always do, that the things that matter most are never the things that seem most powerful. They are the things that make someone turn back, that make someone change, that make someone, against all conditioning and history and expectation, choose love instead. Close your eyes. The stars of the Invincible universe are scattered across the dark behind them, each one a story, each one still turning, patient and bright and waiting for you to return. Sleep well.